Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and I appreciate everybody that took the trouble to come tonight. And I'm going to be speaking about my favorite country, other than my own, which is Mexico. It's a country that I've studied for many years. I grew up almost right on the border in the neighborhood just south of San Diego. So Mexico was always close to me growing up, and I've always been interested in Mexico in many different fashions. Other students can still come in, right? Yes. John, so, yeah. So at any rate, one of the interesting things to have witnessed over the years was Mexico moving from basically an authoritarian, or at least what was often described as soft authoritarian type regime. It wasn't the type of brutal, repressive dictatorship that you often find in many other countries that had authoritarian regimes, but it clearly was not a democracy. And that started to change over a period of time to where today we can say that Mexico is clearly a democracy, but the question becomes what type of democracy. So with that little introduction, we'll start talking about consolidating Mexico's democracy. So before we start talking about Mexico itself, I'd like to introduce some concepts that comparative political scientists like to spend quite a bit of time and quite a bit of paper, use quite a bit of paper discussing these terms. Democracy is not an easy concept to define. The minimalist definition of democracy is simply the ability of citizens to replace one group of elites with another. And that replacement needs to be meaningful. In other words, you're not just replacing figureheads, you're actually replacing one set of elites that has different public policy preferences than a different set of elites. So there's contesting political elites in competitive elections, and the outcome of those elections determines which elites are going to govern. So that's a pretty realistic and minimalist definition of democracy. It's not something most of us would probably accept as what we really think of democracy as, but as you get into other definitions of democracy, you complicate the issue considerably. And my preference is, and many other political scientists, but certainly not all, is to start with the minimalist definition and then build up from that. And then we can isolate specifically what types of other qualities of democracy are we looking at that might distinguish one democracy from another. So Mexico is clearly today a democracy by the minimalist definition of democracy. Liberal democracy, is it a liberal democracy? Now, when I'm talking about liberal democracy, keep in mind what I'm talking about is classic liberalism in the sense of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and others in that classical historical tradition of what liberalism means. And so some of the aspects of democracy that is associated with liberal democracy is free and fair elections with universal suffrage. So for students here, universal suffrage means that everybody has a right to vote that's an adult citizen. Elected officials actually govern, so you're not having an elections that might be free and fair and with universal suffrage, but the elections don't really count. There's really some other authority, like the military, for instance, as it was in Chile for many years, or in Brazil for many years, where there was elections, they were free and fair, but the final say was really up to the military. Or another example might be the clergy, the so-called supreme leader in Iran today. Where they do have free and fair elections for the most part, but those elections aren't necessarily put in place elected officials that have the ultimate say. The rule of law is extremely important in a liberal democracy, so it's not decisions are not made at the whim or the caprice of particular officials, but that there are laws that are applied equally to everybody, at least ideally, and the law governs, so therefore the rule of law. And this gets to the idea of due process too. So a liberal democracy, there's an emphasis on due process, so basic fairness in the administration of the laws. And then respect for human rights. So we're talking about things like free speech, for instance, freedom of religion, freedom from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. So many others, some of which become more controversial and disputed as to whether there should be included in human rights, such as the right to self-determination for ethnic minorities or indigenous people, for instance. So those are some of the basic elements of what is a liberal democracy. Now, before I go on to my slides, let me just ask the audience a question. Do you consider the United States, by this definition of liberal democracy, a democracy, and for how long has it been a democracy?
Maybe partly.
Pardon?
Maybe partly.
Yeah, so even the United States doesn't completely live up to this definition of liberal democracy. In fact, I would argue until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, because African Americans and many other minorities in some other states were effectively excluded from electoral participation. You really didn't have free and fair elections with universal suffrage. You might have free and fair elections, but the suffrage was not universal. So not everybody really had the right to vote, even though in the Constitution everybody was supposed to have the right to vote. So it really, if you take this definition strictly, most countries would have trouble living up to it. And that's the reason the minimalist definition allows us to say, okay, with the minimalist definition, the United States has been a democracy since its founding. But has it truly been a liberal democracy? And I think there's, you have to put a question mark by that, at least until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And even today, there are arguments that could be made that we still fall short of this ideal of a liberal democracy. So I want you to keep that in mind as I talk about Mexico, because any democracy has difficulty living up to this definition of what a liberal democracy is. Okay, so there are other types of what we think of as quasi-democratic regimes. One is a procedural democracy, otherwise often known as an illiberal democracy. So there's not necessarily universal suffrage. There's not necessarily respect for human rights. The rule of law might be very weak. There may be, the military may, for instance, check what elected officials do. So as you notice, that procedural democracy would fit as not a quasi-democracy, but as a democracy according to the minimalist definition of democracy. However, electoral authoritarianism would not. And that's basically what Mexico had for many years, and you find in many other parts of the world, countries who have the procedures of a democracy, they have elections. The elections are often rigged, or even if the votes are counted honestly, there might be only certain parties that are allowed to run that would then support the real powers in the country. And so in that sense, you really do have an authoritarian regime, even though you have the facade of a democracy with elections. Now notice that the minimalist definition is not this electoral authoritarianism. It goes beyond the idea that you can just have the facade, you can just have the procedure of an electoral democracy without really a meaningful competitive elections. So that's one way to distinguish electoral authoritarianism from the minimalist definition of democracy with meaningful competitive elections. So these conceptual issues really complicate the question that we're addressing tonight, which is whether or not Mexico is a liberal democracy, or whether it's just simply a minimalist democracy, a procedural democracy. And so that's the reason scholars and citizens, for that matter, often talk past each other, because they have different things in mind when they're talking about democracy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about democratic consolidation. What does that term mean? Well, basically, it means to secure the gains as a process by which you secure the gains made in democratic norms and institutions. So if you are talking about a procedural democracy, then I think we can safely say that Mexico has consolidated a procedural democracy. It is no longer an electoral authoritarian regime. Throughout the period from 1929, which basically was the institutionalization of the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910, and the dominant party called the PRI, which is the Institutional Revolutionary Party, formed out of the competing caudillos, the military, most of them military generals who were then competing for political power. It replaced that with a more institutionalized type of governmental system in which elections were held, but only those members of the PRI were allowed to win those elections. So if you weren't a member of the dominant party, you were basically out of luck. And they allowed for minor parties, but they basically served the role of supporting the dominant regime because it made it look like Mexico was a democracy during this period from 1929 to 1994. And the 1994 date is somewhat arbitrary and it's debatable. So in 1994, you have the first presidential election where you can clearly say that it was a free and fair election. Election where the votes, were really counted, where there was really competitive parties, and the PRI did win that election. But it had a strong challenge from opposition parties. One of the parties was one that really won the 1988 election by all accounts, but the vote was rigged, so they didn't actually win. And they did fairly well, but not enough to win the presidency in 1994. And then you had the Conservative Party, the PAN, which then did better in 1994. But during this period from 1994 to 2000, while you transition to free and fair elections that are meaningful with competitive parties, you still have a lot of evidence of a lack of the rule of law, of human rights abuses, and the best example of that was the indigenous revolt called the Zapatista Rebellion after Emiliano Zapata, who was a famous hero of the Mexican Revolution from that southern part of Mexico, and mostly centered in the state of Chiapas. The Zapatistas, the indigenous people, and some mestizos too, that joined with them, rebelled against the government. So it was a revolt against the government. The military put it down. There were significant human rights abuses during this period of 1994 through basically the rest of the 1990s. But in 2000, you have another presidential election that is competitive, and in this time the PAN wins. So the PAN is, by the way, the National Action Party is what it stands for. And Vicente Fox, who you may have heard of, was the president who won that election. And is a former businessman and a staunch Catholic. He represented both the social and economic conservatism that the party, the PAN, the National Action Party, stands for. So interestingly enough, it was a conservative party that transitioned, that ultimately transitioned Mexico to the democracy. Although it's a little unfair to put it that way, because the last president that was a member of the PRI, who was Ernesto Zedillo, he deserves a lot of credit for allowing a free and fair election that he knew he had a good chance or he knew the PRI candidate would have a good chance of losing. Presidents in Mexico can't run for re-election. So, and also in 1997, under Ernesto Zedillo, there was a reform to the electoral laws, and a governmental body with a fair degree of independence established called IFE, I-F-E, so the Federal Electoral Institute, that oversaw elections and at the federal level, not the state level. Mexico's a federal system. So at the federal level, elections were overseen by this body which helped ensure a fair and free election. So Vicente Fox becomes the first president in 71 years that was not a member of the PRI. You also have to have a change in Congress. So in 1997, for the first time since the late 1920s, the PRI no longer controls the lower chamber of the House. They're a minority party, largest minority party, and has for most of the time continued to be the largest minority party in the Chamber of Deputies, which is like our House of Representatives in Mexico. And you have then a multi-party system within the Mexican Congress, and later that happened in the upper house, the Senate in Mexico. So you have competitive parties and multiple parties winning elections and holding seats in the Mexican Congress. So whoever the president was, and it's now again a member of the PRI, the president under the Mexican Constitution must, like the President of the United States, have Congress authorize any laws that the President wishes to have enacted and to fund those laws. So Congress is a significant player in the Mexican system now, and that's another piece of evidence that Mexico really has transitioned to at least a procedural democracy, if not truly a fully liberal democracy. So I put a question mark because there are still problems, which I'll go into in a minute, in terms of in Mexico fulfilling those things that I talked about that are associated with liberal democracy, as there is in all democracies. So is the glass half full or is the glass half empty, basically becomes the question. And is Mexico making progress on things like the rule of law, respect of human rights, etc.? Now, one way of looking at this, and the literature on Mexico and the political science literature on Mexico often confuses what might be called democratic deepening. So a deepening of the democratic process, more of a commitment to liberal democratic values, with the idea, excuse me, with the idea of consolidation. And so deepening refers to a genuine democracy, a complete democracy, in other words, a liberal democracy in the classical sense of what liberalism means. Okay, so what type of democracy is Mexico today? Well, like I said, it's definitely a procedural democracy, but can we really call it a consolidated liberal democracy? Now, I think I've gone over these points already, that it's a procedural democracy because there are competitive elections that are, for the most part, honest. Another thing, no democracy has completely honest elections, including the United States. So there's going to be electoral fraud in any country. And we've had it here. It's just a matter of degree. So for the most part, you have free and honest elections in Mexico. The local and state elections is where most of the fraud still takes place, because the IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute, does not supervise state elections, just federal elections. And one of the reforms before Mexico right now is expanding the authority of IFE to be able to supervise state elections so as to make sure that those are honest elections too. Electoral officials actually do the governing. There's no really foreseeable threats of a military coup, of civil insurrection, foreign invasion. So we can definitely call Mexico a consolidated procedural democracy. But deepening or consolidating in the liberal sense is the issue that we'll address. Positive evidence of a liberal democracy in Mexico. Well, I've already talked about IFE. IFE, so the Federal Electoral Institute in 1997. That's a major reform that's really important. In the Indigenous Rights Act of 2001, one of the first things that Vicente Fox did interestingly enough, as the president of the Conservative Party, the PON, is that he promised in his electoral campaign that he was going to push through an indigenous rights bill, and he did. Now, it didn't completely satisfy the indigenous rights groups, but it made a significant progress towards respecting indigenous rights, providing some local autonomy for indigenous people to be able to govern their own affairs in a number of different ways. So it definitely was a big step in the right direction, although indigenous people are still very marginalized in Mexico, and that still is a major issue. And they make up about 12% of the population. The Transparency Act of 2003, it was expanded even more in 2008, set up this institute called the Institute for the Federal Institute for Access to Information is what those initials stand for. And so the government has become more open. There's more progress to be made on that. There's another reform to expand the powers of IFAHI. But progress certainly has been made in making a more transparent, open government, which is part of establishing a true liberal democracy. Judicial reforms. One of the big weaknesses of Mexican democracy is the lack of the rule of law. And so this judicial reform of 2008 was a significant progress. It's an ongoing process. There's still a lot of progress to be made, but the judiciary has been made more independent. There's better processes in place to ensure due process and the right for defendants to be able to defend themselves and cross-examine witnesses. They're moving in that direction. There's a growing civil society movement in Mexico. So since 2000, we've really seen an acceleration in the number of civil society organizations that are making demands on government, all the way from environmental groups to indigenous rights groups to transparency groups and so on. So independent watchdog media. Under the authoritarian regime, the government basically bought off and made sure that the news media, and particularly the press, kept in line. Today we have very independent press in Mexico. They are very aggressively criticize government. Some might argue even too aggressively. This is a little less true of the electronic media, where there's not sufficient diversity in electronic media. One of the other reforms Mexico needs to tackle. But the newspapers vigorously criticize the regime and express a broad range of opinions, which was not the case in past years. And very important, since Catholicism is about 85% of Mexicans are Catholic, the Catholic Church, starting in really the 1970s at least, really threw its weight behind the support for democracy. And the history in Mexico was just the opposite throughout Mexican history since the conquest. So the role of the Catholic Church in supporting democratic processes is very important. Now, negative evidence for why we might not want to call Mexican democracy a fully consolidated liberal democracy. Well, political corruption is still significant. Probably not as widespread as most Norte Americanos think it is because of the way it's reported in our press and the stereotype that we tend to have in the United States about Mexican corruption. There is a lot of corruption. However, it's not like the most corrupt country in the world, not even close to it. So Transparency International has a corruption perception index, and this is a perception, so this is not real corruption, this is people's perceptions in Mexico of the amount of corruption. And they scored 34 on a scale of 100. The higher you are on the scale, the less corrupt the country is. So the lower it is, the more corrupt, at least the perception is. So 34 is a fairly low score, but as you can see, it's 105th out of 176 countries that are part of the index. So if we go to a Transparency International website, we can see here that if you look at this mouse here, there we go. you can see that the score is 0, dark red means a high degree of corruption. So there are countries that are more corrupt. In Latin America, Venezuela is considered considerably more corrupt than Mexico is, for instance. A number of countries in Africa and some other parts of the world, as you can see. And you notice, by the way, just parenthetically, the United States is not the least corrupt country in the world. Some of the Norwegian countries and Canada and Australia, for instance, do better than we do on this index. So, yes, corruption is a big problem in Mexico. Progress is being made, though, to lessening corruption. Media intimidation. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Okay, domestic security. So the level of violence in Mexico, another stereotype about Mexico in the sense that people in the United States probably exaggerate, mainly thanks to our news media, the level of violence. So there is an unacceptable level of violence in Mexico. It is a major problem and a concern for Mexican citizens. However, again, Mexico is not the most violent country in the world by any means. So if you look at Mexico right there, you can see that there's about 11.5 people murdered each year, homicides, out of a per 100,000 population. And Mexico has a population of 116 million people, to try to put that in context. So there are countries where the murder rate is considerably higher. Definitely a problem for Mexico. If your life is not secure, if you're not safe, then it's hard to claim Mexico as a liberal democracy. And so that is certainly a concern. Media intimidation by the drug cartels is a concern too. Much of this violence is violence between the drug cartels, but by no means all of it. But the media has particularly been targeted, and certainly a free press is an essential part of a liberal democracy. And the drug cartels have gone after journalists who have reported on what the drug cartels are doing, and therefore most journalists don't report on what the drug cartels are doing. Mexico is one of the most unsafe countries in the world to be a journalist. So definitely a negative indicator of liberal democracy in Mexico. Police abuses are rampant in Mexico. Many citizens, having been there a lot, many citizens would prefer to take care of things themselves than to go to the police because they just don't trust the police. Human rights abuses by the military in the drug war have been highly unacceptable. One thing in Mexico is that the Mexican military does pretty much police itself, and that was agreed upon to keep the military out of intervening in the government, to keep them separate, to say, we'll let you police yourself. So human rights abuse trials by soldiers and officers that commit such abuses are tried in the military, and very few are found guilty. So that's a major problem. The impunity in the justice system. Only about 10% of people charged with crimes get prosecuted successfully, so convicted in court. Now, one would probably assume that not only 10% are guilty. So the impunity is certainly a major negative. Marginalization of indigenous people, I've already referred to that. That's a continuing problem despite the 2001 Indigenous Rights Bill. Poverty and inequality is a continuing problem. I got some statistics coming up on that. Okay, so this is about theories of democratic consolidation. How do democracies become more consolidated? Well, one theory is this elite commitment to democratic norms theory. So politics is not such a high-stake game. In other words, politicians are willing to lose. If they lose, they're not going to take up arms or go to the military and ask them to perform a military coup. They just try harder at the next election. Willingness to compromise. You have to ask that about the United States, about how willing we are to compromise anymore. But so again, all of this is relative. But if politicians aren't willing to compromise, the democracy won't work. Democracy requires compromise. So no significant anti-system parties. So if a party says we're opposed to the regime, not just the people in power, not just the party in power, then that can undermine the democracy. And then I'd say just a brief word about the 2006 presidential election. It was a disputed election, kind of like our 2000 election, about the same margin, around 400,000 vote difference between the PON, the Conservative Party, and the PRD, the Liberal Party, what we call liberal. They wouldn't call it liberal in Mexico, the party on the left. And so it was a razor-thin victory by the PON, by the Conservative Party. And the presidential candidate, whose nickname was AMLO, Lopez Obrador, he contested the election. I was in Mexico then. It was very interesting. And there was demonstrations and encampments in what's called the Zocalo, the big square in Mexico City. There was, talk about that the newly elected president was illegitimate. In essence, it was an anti-system movement. The evidence that I have seen is that, well, keeping in mind, no election is completely fair and honest. For the most part, this was a honestly conducted election under IFE, the Electoral Institute, and that in all probability, it just was a really razor-thin election. And probably Calderon, who was the PON candidate, got elected president free and fairly. But that was certainly when a lot of people started talking about, well, is Mexico really a consolidated democracy? Political institutions that work is another theory. This is the institutional perspective. And balancing policy resoluteness with decisiveness is a key concept. So you want a government that is going to, if institutions are going to be effective, you want a government that's going to be able to make decisions and carry them through, not just change at a whim. You want some continuity in public policies. At the same time, you need to address problems, and therefore you need some decisiveness too. So it's that balance between resoluteness and decisiveness that is really important in order to try to have a government that is actually going to work. So political institutions that will actually govern effectively. And a big question mark, and which is the focus of a lot of my research, is can a multi-party presidential system do this? So parliamentary systems, which I don't have time to get into the reasons, but parliamentary systems can accommodate multiple parties more easily. Some argue that a presidential system really needs a two-party system, as in the United States. I would argue that's not the case. I think there's several examples in Latin America where you have presidential systems with multiple parties that are governed fairly effectively. The key is trying to get those parties to come to some type of coalitions to get things done, to form coalitions to get things done. Now, public support for democracy. This is looking at public opinion. Support for democracy in Mexico is weak. And you can see the figures there. Mexicans and other Latin Americans tend to look at democracy not so much as a procedural matter, but as a substantive matter. So if we have democracy, we should be having improving economic conditions. We should have better respect for human rights. People from the United States tend to look at democracy more as a procedural matter. So those are tendencies. But if you compare within Latin America, you can see that support for democracy in all these democratic Latin American countries, in Uruguay has gone up from 41% to 81%. And in Argentina, which has had its problems, it's gone up from 38% to 59%. In Venezuela, interestingly enough, which I would not classify as a liberal democracy by any means, I'm not even, I think you might be able to classify it as a procedural democracy, but certainly it's an illiberal procedural democracy. That it's pretty much held even, 39 to 42%, no significant difference. But Mexico is is pretty much held even too, even though I would rate Mexico as much more democratic than Venezuela, at least when it comes to the types of liberal democratic norms we're talking about, as opposed to another concept of democracy which places more emphasis on substance like equality and representing the masses and things like that, which you could argue then Venezuela would be a democracy in that sense. So Mexico is down there at pretty much at the bottom. I think Honduras is the only other country that is lower than Mexico in Latin America for public support of democracy. Most Mexicans do not think their country is a democracy. I disagree with them. I think it is. How consolidated the liberal type of democracy is debatable. Okay, then, yeah, sure.
So is it public support for democracy or public belief in democracy that they have democracy? What's that figure showing?
It shows, I didn't put the exact wording down there. The question, to paraphrase, is basically, are you satisfied with the democratic government that exists in fill in the blank, Mexico or Venezuela, etc.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily indicate that Mexicans do not believe in democracy. Okay. There is actually a different question in the survey, and there's a large majority do believe in the concept of democracy, but they're not satisfied with the way democracy exists in their country. Now,
is that the same? I mean, you might have people in this country that are dissatisfied with Obama being president, and they might answer no to that, even though they would say that we have a democracy, or?
The survey tried to make that distinction. So there's another question on the survey about your satisfaction with the current administration. So this question attempts to, it's hard to disentangle this, but the question attempts to get at satisfaction with the way democracy in general is working in your country. Another theory is economic performance, so material well-being, and also that includes both economic growth and economic equity. So as you can see, Mexico has had a fairly decent growth rate. In 1995, the gross domestic product per capita, adjusted for current prices, so adjusted for inflation, and purchasing power parity, which is the best way that economists measure it, has gone up from 7,532 to where in 2010 to just over 15,000. So that's not the type of growth rate that you've seen, for instance, in China, but it's around a 4 or 5% growth rate per year, which is fairly substantial. Now, however, you look at Mexico on what's called the Gini index, which is a way of measuring inequality in the country. It rates very high. By the way, the United States rates pretty high too. It's 40-something, above 40%, or above 0.40. So it's ranked the 25th most unequal country in the world. And that should be 136 for the end, excuse me. So out of 136 countries, Mexico is the 25th most unequal country. Poverty is 40 to 50% of the population. So it's a while it's growing economically, it's a highly unequal country with a very large percentage of its population living in poverty. Now, contagion is, and I need to start wrapping up, so I'll run through these a little quicker. Contagion means basically the external environment. So, end of the Cold War, the end of bureaucratic authoritarian military dictatorships in Latin America. Basically, this has fostered democracy throughout Latin America. It's one of the explanations for why Mexico moved towards democracy. However, the new left in Latin America has challenged that. Without going through each of those points, Venezuela would be probably the primary example. Some other countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, are examples of the new left in Latin America. And these new left countries like Venezuela tend to be, at best, procedural democracies, not liberal democracies. But of course, some would reject this idea of liberal democracy and say what really matters is a democracy's commitment to the people, basically meaning the majority of the people who are poor. So here I'm using the concept of liberal democracy, and most of these new left Latin American regimes, such as the one in Venezuela, do not adhere to liberal norms of democracy, and that is another alternative model that Mexico could adopt if Mexican citizens decide to reject the type of democracy that is currently in Mexico. Success matters, in my opinion. I think the way you consolidate democracy in Mexico is that you continue to promote even more vigorous economic growth, but along with social justice, with more equity, and you improve the security situation in Mexico, and I think Mexico will move to a more consolidated democracy. So, public policies, there's been greater investment in education, there's been some improvement in state revenues. The government needs money in order to tackle the problems of equity and to invest in infrastructure and education to grow the economy. 22.7% is low. 144th out of 214 countries, and much of that revenue comes from Mexico's oil rather than from other sources such as taxes. And so that's an important policy area that Mexico needs to tackle. Also, there's too many monopolies in Mexico. The gentleman that competes with, for the richest man in the world is from Mexico, Carlos Slim, and head of Telemex and other telecommunication companies. There's a highly concentrated economic wealth among a small group of families in Mexico, and those monopolies need to be broken up. And there's been some effort in that direction, but Mexico has further to go. There's also labor market rigidities. So labor unions have been very powerful in Mexico to the point of deciding who gets hired and who gets fired. Well, I am a firm believer in labor unions that can control employment, who gets jobs and who cannot, and that are not internally democratic, are a problem, and that needs to be addressed in Mexico, and Mexico has some success in addressing that. There's been laws strengthening the rule of law, but it's still a lot of progress needs to be made. In the social safety network, there's been progress there. Since we have about 15 minutes left, I'm going to stop there. I have a few more slides, but we will leave those off so we can get your questions.
What's voter behavior like? They don't have a lot of faith in democracy. What's the turnout? Are there structural barriers to actually get to the polls? About
the same as the United States, so pretty poor. We have, somewhere around 50% turnout in large elections, which is about the case in the United States of eligible voters. In smaller elections, it's even less, like in the United States. However, in Mexico, it's the law to vote. And there's voter ID cards that are issued in Mexico. And you can be denied benefits from the government if you don't have your voter ID card and kept it current. So when you add that onto it, it's pretty surprising how low voter turnout is. So there's a lot of disenchantment with democracy in Mexico.
So with the Indigenous Rights Act, was Vicente Fox, was he kind of courting a lot of the indigenous groups to try and get votes for his party? Or he just thought it was the right thing to do?
He wasn't, I would say he wasn't so much courting the indigenous groups as he was the political left in Mexico. Because the reason that, which did not happen in 1994, but in the 2000 election, Vicente Fox won by creating an anti-PRI coalition. So citizens on the left and politicians on the left joined with Vicente Fox, the conservative, as the best alternative to defeat the PRI. So the 2000 election was, let's finally, after 71 years, kick the PRI out. and vote somebody else into office. And so he was voted in with the support of people on the left in many cases because he was a more valuable candidate than the candidate that the leftist party had put up and put up for election. And so therefore, Vicente Fox needed to offer the left something, and his commitment to indigenous rights was one of the things he offered, because people on the left had to swallow rather hard to vote for him. And when it came to social conservatism particularly, I would say, but also probably some of his economic policies, which were very pro-business.
Did he make a lot of other concessions besides that then? Or was
no, that was,
mostly social?
I would say that's the main one. Yeah, the main one was indigenous rights, because really, and the big carrot he held out to the left was that was kicking the PRI out. So actually making the transition to democracy, finalizing that transition to democracy. And he presented himself as a more moderate conservative, a more compassionate conservative. If we remember the 2000 election in the United States, so George W. Bush was the compassionate conservative. So that's basically Fox was the compassionate conservative in the Mexican election of 2000.
A question about media. You said that at least print media is like independent, robust, criticize government. But I was wondering, is it what is the general characterization of media? Is it like entertainment centric, sensational, like here in the USA, or is it a different tone there?
It's very adversarial. Yeah, I'd say. I mean, the Mexican press is very adversarial. Now, you do have certain papers that are identified more on the left and more on the right, but and then more in the center. But for the most part, it's a professional journalists that are for the big mainstream papers that are vigorously playing the watchdog role in terms of Mexican government. Now, as I said, you don't have that so much because you have two major, in electronic media, you have, or at least television, you have two main media companies that control the television networks. And one of the reforms that Mexico needs to pursue is to break up these, and one of those networks is owned by Carlos Slim, is to break up those television networks and diversify television programming and coverage of the news. And interestingly, there's actually an interesting wrinkle to that, is one of the campaign in the last election, when the 2012 election, when Peña Nieto, the current president, who is of the PRI, was accused of, because his wife worked for one of the major television networks, was accused of having too close a link, and there was actually money that was given to his campaign from, I think it was Telemundo, if I remember correctly. And, but actually he supported a law that we'll see what happens, that is going to be regulating the television industry, and may act, but hasn't yet, to break up that. So the agency is in place that could take action against these television networks, and people didn't expect him to support that, but he did. In fact, now he supported it, he pushed it. Brad.
Question, you have the security issues up there, and I think it was up earlier on your slide for evidence raising questions about the consolidation of democracy. And what are the connections there between lack of security and whether or not we would regard it as democratic? I mean, why aren't those just independent things?
Yeah.
I mean, is the idea there that if you don't have security, people aren't going to buy into the government? But I mean, that seems independent of whether the government is democratic or not. Or is it that that sort of, because it didn't show up in any of the definitions that to be democratic you have to have a certain level of security and stuff. What are, I mean, What are the connections there?
Well, I think the connection goes through the incompetence and outright corruption of the police and the military when it comes to trying to protect citizens. So that's where the connection would be. If the government...
Is the assumption then that a democratic society will do these things competently? And
a liberal democratic society, yeah.
It's not democratic?
Right. If you have the rule of law, if the law is applied fairly and universally, and government officials, police, military, and judges do not look the other way and actually enforce the law, then you're going to have less violence. I mean, any society is going to have violence and crime. Right. So you're going to have less of that. And so the argument would be that the government has been complicit in the levels of violence that exist in Mexico because of a lack of commitment to due process.
Right. Because, I mean, one of the things about that authoritarian regimes will play as a calling card is that they can make things secure.
Right.
And so,
good point.
That's why I was wondering whether this is more a question about how competent the government is rather than how democratic it is.
I think it's both. You know, I mean, I think it's failure to adhere to the rule of law to a reasonable extent, but it's also a matter of competence, I would say too. But your basic point is absolutely correct. I mean, if you have, just because a society has a very low crime rate does not indicate that it is therefore a liberal democracy. It could be a harsh authoritarian regime.
That's Saudi Arabia, probably.
Yeah.
And then the other, one of the potentially negative factors is the inequality thing. And, once again, should we assume that a democratic society is going to be more equal? I mean, especially if we're thinking about classic liberalism. Classic liberalism is standardly paired with, a commitment to capitalism, and capitalism is at least comfortable with huge inequality. And so, I mean, it would seem like you could have a very classically liberal sort of society with some huge inequality. I mean, is there an assumption here that to be truly democratic, we've got to move away from that kind of that kind of classic liberalism and move to a more, recognition of positive rights to
social welfare.
Yeah, social welfare and that sort of thing. I mean, is that?
Yeah, I don't.
The theorists here are bringing the inequality in, or?
No, I don't think so. And if I present it that way, I didn't mean to. Certainly, classic liberalism accepts high levels of inequality. So my argument is that if you're going to consolidate a liberal democracy, you really can't have those high levels of inequality, that you will not have the support from citizens when you have 40 to 50% poverty, and when you have the type of inequality which creates, even though the economy is improving, a sense of relative deprivation because of this high level of inequality. So while it's not part of what you define or conceptualize as a liberal democracy, I would argue that more equity is important to consolidating a liberal democracy and making it firm so it'll continue to exist and promote the values that a liberal democracy represents.
I think to answer this question, it's just my thought. System crash, you know what I'm saying? So if it is like too much inequality, then over time there might be movements that will undermine the system, the capitalist system, democratic system. I think that's.
And Venezuela is a great example of that.
Probably so.
And certainly there's those that would argue that and particularly those in the government in Venezuela, that's more of a true democracy. That a true democracy is really a democracy that serves the people, where you're not going to have these unacceptably high levels of inequality and gross poverty.
But their understanding they're putting up a different norm than what you put up.
Yeah.
You put up liberal democracy
Right.
as the norm, and they're, from what you said, they're explicitly rejecting that as the proper norm, right?
Yes.
So what they're labeling true democracy is being defined in terms of,
Populism, I think.
yeah, needing a certain amount of social welfare.
Well, and I think it goes beyond that,
Yeah.
not just social welfare, but that liberal democratic norms can be violated in the name of trying to achieve more social justice. And that liberal democracies will inherently be unequal and will promote those who have the economic power in society in a capitalist system. So that is definitely
Right.
definitely the dispute.
And so then, if you're pointing to inequality as a concern, is the concern here that, look, if the society doesn't deal with inequality, then that is going to lead to a move in this other direction? That we've got to make things more equal, or somebody else is going to do it in a way we don't like?
Yes, I think so. I guess the way I would put it is that, from my personal perspective, that social justice is a value. So more equity in society, which would mean greater levels of equality. To eliminate as much as possible poverty. So those social justice issues are important, but so are, for me, and for those that believe in a liberal democracy, are norms about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process rights, things like that. And my argument is that if you want a liberal democracy, you also have to have social justice in order to consolidate that liberal democracy. Otherwise, Mexico or some other country might look to Venezuela as the example that it should copy. In fact, if that election in 2006 had gone a few 100,000 votes in the other direction, then Andres Lopez Obrador may have moved Mexico more towards the model that Venezuela has. I would say he probably would have. Probably not to that extent. Because there's a lot of there are other countries like, for instance, Ecuador, or even, you might even say, Argentina today, that are in this new liberal movement, or I should say leftist movement, the new left movement in Latin America. And you'd see Mexico more in that direction. And to the extent that it did not violate liberal democratic norms, then to me, that would not necessarily be a bad thing. It might be a good thing. It's a balance of at the same time you need economic growth and you need more equity in society. So how do you get the combination of the two? That's the trick. And frankly, Venezuela, while putting a lot of emphasis on social equity, the government has done a very poor job in creating economic growth. Mexico is doing much better than Venezuela is on economic growth, but not on economic equality. That's the dilemma.
Well, I got a very basic question, and it applies to our country then too, It's like, so why in a democracy do you have inequality? If you've got people can vote their interests, obviously people are voting against their interests, it seems. Otherwise, why would they vote to have a system in place that makes them poor? So it seems that it's not really an informed democracy. It might be a democracy, but the citizenry is not apparently informed enough to vote their own interests, which is what I think.
Of course,
our country.
Of course, what we're doing by putting it that way is we are assuming we know what people's interests are better than they do.
Well, I guess if you're holding up disparity as being bad, I'm not changing the argument there.
Yeah. Well, I think people will vote for parties that are not going to promote greater social and economic equity because they care about other things, such as social conservatism. And so So then,
Or they've been hoodwinked into caring about those things.
possibly, but then, you know, I'm reticent to judge whether people are assessing their own interests correctly. I mean, I don't want to put myself in that position.
I would.
But will you accept that criticism that, you know, I know that comes from many leftist thinkers, like, you know, what he was saying, it's like, you know, Gramsci's theory of hegemony, that, you know, you willingly accept that, you know, even if it goes against your economic interest, it can be social conservatism, other things. But will you accept that premise that, you know, people like, you know, in the US we can have a good democracy, but not informed citizens. By informed citizen, I mean that, you know, those critical information that people will need, and that again links with media. What type of media do we have here?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One is that I think the less people are informed, that the less likely they are probably to vote and participate in their own interest. So informed citizenry, I think, is very important. But I'm uncomfortable going with the Marxian view of false consciousness, because, I mean, there are other values that are important to people. You know, for some people, the religious values are what's most important, and well, you know, Marx would say that's the opiate of the people, and therefore they have false consciousness and are therefore empowering the capitalist elite who are oppressing them and creating this inequality in society. I mean, you certainly can make that argument, but I would be uncomfortable doing so, going that far, because I don't think that economic, material values are the only values.
I'm positive that, you know, many people will consider that is very elitist. Like, remember that what Obama said in those, like, you know, that off-the-cuff comment that, you know, it's very difficult to deal with those, you know, people in Pennsylvania because they stick to their guns and religion.
Yeah, they got in a little trouble. That was one of those off-camera remarks. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, and bring this back to Mexico, the reason the PAN, two PAN presidents in a row from the Conservative Party, is being able to present a platform that convinced the majority of Mexicans that they were the party that could promote economic growth better, and therefore lift, you know, all boats. And that they were the party that represented the social conservative views that are closely associated with Catholicism in Mexico. So as a heavily Catholic country, many Catholics would support the PAN. Although there's actually surveys on that, and it's not as much as one would think, the Catholic influence for the vote in the PAN. So I think the main explanation is that the Conservative Party was able to convince people that it was better promoting economic growth.
I just have one quick question I wanted to ask. You had said that there are multi-parties and that their legislature was very important in the governmental process. You know, we just have primarily the two parties, and we often speak of the third party brings up some issues that the other two parties don't want to deal with. Would you say that their government is more well-functioning than ours?
No, I wouldn't say that, because there are, you know, and I've alluded to some of those and mentioned some of them. There's important reforms that need to take place in Mexico, and those reforms have not been enacted to a large extent. There have been some reforms. There was education reform last fall. There's other reforms I mentioned too, like the electoral system, the judicial system, etc. But there are a number of important reforms that Mexico needs to enact in order to both promote economic growth and greater economic equity. And they haven't been able to do it because of inability to form coalitions to put through the type of legislation that's needed. And one of the basic reforms is, as I mentioned, is for the government to be able to take in more money in order to build infrastructure, fund education better, provide a better social safety network, and the tax collection revenue is very low. That becomes a big political issue, as it is in this country, and so a lot of similar problems. But we have a two-party system, and we're having similar problems here in the United States too. So my opinion is that compromise is needed, and you need to form coalitions. Whether those coalitions are in a two-party system, cross-party coalitions, like we've often done for major legislation historically in the United States, or whether they're multi-party coalitions. So my research is oriented to trying to understand why coalitions sometimes form but usually do not in this multi-party democracy that Mexico has.
Do Mexican politicians talk much about immigration? And if so, kind of what's the tone of that conversation? Is it about economic growth in Mexico?
It's not nearly as big a topic as it is in the United States, because there's really no legislation that Mexico needs to address it. It's the United States that needs to pass legislation to address the question of immigration. Now there was one.
Guatemala or anything? Do they talk about like Guatemala?
Yeah, that's a bigger issue. Yeah, immigrants coming in from Guatemala or other parts of Central America who are often abused, mistreated. Money's taken from them. Sometimes they're killed. So there's a big southern border issue in Mexico. There is a lot of resentment, though, towards the United States over the immigration issue, because from the standpoint of Mexicans, people are coming north to make a living, and they're not being given due process rights in the United States. And yet they're contributing to the U.S. economy and holding down jobs that Americans aren't willing to take, would be the perspective, which I think is for the most part true, though not completely. And then a lot of people die trying to cross the border, and families are separated. So there's a very different perspective on the immigration issue from the viewpoint of Mexicans than it is from the viewpoint of people in the United States. Same thing would be true with drugs. Here Mexico suffered horrendously from this horrendous drug war that Mexico is trying to prosecute in order to keep the cartels from exporting drugs to the United States, where people are buying the drugs. So we're the consumers in the United States, and they view us as the main problem in terms of why they have so much drug cartel violence in Mexico. Plus, the United States ships down illegally firearms to Mexican drug cartels. And so that's another sore issue, besides the general history of the relationships between the United States and Mexico, with the Mexican-American War and Mexico losing about half its territory to the United States with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So yet, interestingly enough, every time I go to Mexico, they're the friendliest people in the world, and they're really welcoming. But there's some historical and present issues that create tension between the United States and Mexico, which is a whole other topic. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Knight. That was very nice. And thank you all for coming and supporting the Great Lecture Series. I really do appreciate it. Again, thank you.
Thank you.